add a hash or what's called a digital fingerprint, and then if that image is ever shared on Facebook or its subsidiaries, that it'll be immediately blocked because it'll make a match with the image that you uploaded. Now, it's great that these companies are taking proactive steps to try and address this issue, but there are some real risks associated there around, you know, what happens if the perpetrator alters the image? Is it able to make a match? I'm not quite sure about that. And also, what happens if you're underage and you're sending images to yourself? In Australia, there are a number of jurisdictions where that's actually a criminal offence. And also, who gets to see these images before the hash is created? So there are some issues there. And then, of course, there are a whole range of other measures that are being taken by social media companies and technology companies. For instance, some of the porn sites even have policies and practices. You might be surprised. Pornhub used to have porn all over its reporting page, but they've kindly removed the images, which is, you know, I know it's a problematic site, but, you know, there are some things that are happening. There's a reporting page, and apparently Pornhub has actually been quite good in removing images when a report has been made. And even the ex-girlfriend websites, where there's a deliberate invitation to post images of people and to post information about where they live, what their name is, what their age is, what their occupation is, in some cases where they live. Even those websites have policies around this type of thing. But in many cases, I mean, it's just a joke because they're not that interested in removing non-consensual images of adult women. Where they are more interested is to remove images of child exploitation material because it's more heavily clamped down upon than nude or sexual images of adults. So I've really run over, I had 45 minutes, I've got about 10 seconds. So just to end, we need to improve information and support to those who experience image-based abuse and to a diversity of people, so people with disabilities, Indigenous people, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, intersex people, young people as well. We need to have community education, awareness and prevention. Obviously that's really important. It shouldn't be focused on the young girl who shouldn't have taken the images, which a lot of those messages, that's what the message is, rather than on perpetrators and bystanders. We do need better resources for police. They are very overwhelmed in terms of cyber crime investigations. There's no doubt about it. It's incredibly expensive, incredibly time consuming. We do need to improve legal protections. We do need to continue to see action from social media and online platforms and technology companies to improve the action and the policies and the practices around removal of requests. And we do need to have better training for those working with individuals who experience image-based abuse, as well as the criminal justice authorities. Thanks very much.
So thank you very much, Nicola. I'd now, great pleasure to welcome Dr. Fiona Vera-Gray, who is I don't know how you say that actually, Leverhulme, it's quite complicated, Leverhulme, early career research fellow in the Department of Law at Durham University in the UK. She comes from a practice-based background, working in specialist sexual violence sector for over a decade, both as a frontline support provider and an expert in sexual violence prevention with young people. She's also had extensive experience as a campaigner and activist against violence against women. Fiona did her MA and PhD at the Child and Women Abuse Studies Unit at London Metropolitan University, which I think a lot of us know about that unit and the amazing work that it produces. She's currently doing research, what we're going to hear about on another day, another time, on women and pornography. But most of her research to date has been in the area of violence against women and girls. She has a new book out this year with Routledge, which I'm really looking forward to reading, called Men's Intrusion, Women's Embodiment, a Critical Analysis of Street Harassment. And today she's talking about rethinking street harassment. So welcome.
Cool. Thank you, Nicola. Thank you, everybody. I was late this morning because I went to the wrong university, so that's a really nice way of starting. But I'm glad that I got here in time. I got to hear the very end of what you were saying. It sounds like it's really timely that we're having this, both because of what's happening within the institution and also what's happening on the world stage with the Me Too hashtag and Hollywood and UK Parliament. And I don't know what's been happening in New Zealand, but I'm sure that we can pick that up in the discussion. So I've been working on women's experiences of sexual harassment in public, which, as I'll talk about, is a space that is a lot of the time not spoken about in terms of research and policy around sexual harassment. And I've been doing that since around 2010, 2011. But there's something quite different about talking about it now. So I've been lecturing on it the past few weeks, and it's just been very interesting because there seems to be a different receptivity or there's something different going on in the context at the moment. So I'd be really interested, I guess, to hear a little bit more about anyone's thoughts about why that is, why it seems to be something that people want to talk about now, why it's suddenly being seen as valid and not being dismissed as trivial. Yet, touch wood. But for now, what I want to focus on is some of what I found about the meaning and the impact of sexual harassment in terms of women's safety work. I was thinking a lot when you were talking, Nicola, about women's online safety work and something that I've written on before around just abuse that feminists get online. But yeah, thinking about women's online safety work in terms of how that might translate in terms of our own restrictions on taking pictures that we might want to or sending pictures that we might want to. And thinking about safety work in terms of how it limits women's freedom. There's this tension between safety and freedom to feel more safe. Women a lot of the times are doing things that actually mean that we're less free. But a lot of this kind of talking about women's responses and how it changes behaviours is actually absent from the conversation around sexual harassment, even today. We focus on raising awareness of the range and extent of sexual harassment, which needs to happen. I'm really glad that that's happening. But largely it's happening to the deficit of actually recognising women's resistance and women's resilience. And the silence around that can help to reproduce gender norms that underpin inequality, so it can start to reproduce the norms that women are acted on rather than that we act out. If we know that changing those norms is key to preventing violence against women, which we do now really start to know, the prevention literature is really starting to show that, then I think that we need to focus a little bit more on speaking about women's resistance, even when that's just a kind of ordinary or everyday form of resistance. So, just starting with sexual harassment, I'm sure you all know a lot about this, but it's just a good way to kind of start it. Is that it's a term that we hear a lot, but where did it come from? How did we get this term? And it's one of the many that feminists invented, which is brilliant. Prior to the 70s, it didn't exist. The practices existed, but there was no name, there was no collective for the practices. And so without that, it existed as something that Miranda Fricker terms a hermeneutical, and I cannot say that word, injustice. I've said it about a million times, I always say it wrong. But it's an injustice because you can't actually bring something into language, you can't talk about it. And it's hidden from collective understanding because it can't be spoken about. Lynn Farley's sexual shakedown is generally credited alongside Catherine McKinnon with bringing the term sexual harassment into everyday language. Both were focused on occupational sexual harassment, with McKinnon in particular looking at legislative redress. This occupational context was soon broadened to include educational contexts. In the UK in particular, we do a lot of stuff now in universities. I don't know if that started to happen here. I know it happens, in Australia. So looking at sexual harassment in universities, we've also done some work on sexual harassment in schools. And then what seems to be happening now is it's gone back to workplaces, but kind of going into the institutions, really. Hollywood is kind of a cultural institution, UK Parliament, and now what's coming out about the American media. But Lynn Farley, who's the woman that's generally credited with inventing the term, she wrote in October of this year, in response to everything that's going on around sexual harassment, about how the term that she coined has been made bloodless. And it's interesting. Her piece is really interesting. I'd really recommend reading it, because kind of what she's saying is that instead of responses focused on prevention or on education, on revolution, sexual harassment's kind of been absorbed into companies' policies and procedures, and it's become kind of a necessary inevitability for an employer to address on a similar level to I don't know, staff grievances or long-term sick leave. It's just something that needs to be included. Yes, we've got a sexual harassment policy, tick. Yes, everyone's had training, tick. I want to return to this point at the end of the talk and thinking about taking action and how we don't lose sight of the possibility of primary prevention. Okay, but however, throughout the course of sexual harassment, did exist, occupation, education, institution, public space is largely absent as a context, and that's been the area of my study. The literature that does exist on public sexual harassment gives lots of different reasons. There is a growing literature, which has been kind of fueled by the use of online forums to raise awareness of the range and extent. So things like trivialisation and normalisation, you know, is it really that bad if some guy on the street is telling you to cheer up or saying hello beautiful? Is that really the biggest thing that we have to be worried about in today? And normalisation, I mean, definitely in my research, the amount that this just becomes part of what it means to go outside as a woman means that it's very difficult in terms of research to get the numbers that policy love. It's really hard to get that because a lot of it is just forgotten, becomes the background. Something some of my participants framed as just part of growing up. And there's also kind of a lack of interest a lot of the time in research and policy on our everyday lives. You want to focus on the extraordinary rather than the ordinary, the everyday. There's also this thing that I've written around the dominance of legal and medical frames for understanding violence against women and girls. I don't know if it's the same kind of context down here, but in the UK, definitely, there's a big focus on this kind of the trauma ideology. So if you want to talk about the impacts of violence against women, you have to frame it in terms of trauma, you have to frame it in terms of mental health. And I mean, that in itself, I can critique that in itself, but it becomes particularly difficult when you look at street harassment, and a lot of women do not feel traumatised, do not feel that it has an impact on their mental health. And so that means that the impacts sometimes become, again, unspeakable. And it's really hard to respond to through legislation, something I'll come back to again towards the end of this talk. Lots of places have tried, New Zealand is one of them, but it's hard because of the fleetingness of the encounter. Can you really be bothered calling the cops and telling them that that happened? Don't you just want to actually get where you were going? Because this is something that isn't happening in a space where you are doing something. It's generally happening in a space where you're travelling from A to B. And for a lot of women, it's got to be recognised that space is actually the only time that we get to ourselves. Particularly women have caring responsibilities in the home, going to work. Public space becomes a space to be in yourself. There also is this lack of shared terminology. It's quite interesting to be talking about this and the connections to image-based sexual abuse and the problems with terminology. We're all grappling around to try and find the right words, and the words that we come up with sometimes are kind of clumsy and they're not that catchy, and so sometimes things have names that kind of run away with before we've actually properly thought it through. Street harassment is one of them, which I'll talk about in a minute. But because it has this lack of terminology, it means it's quite difficult to compare the research that has been done across studies, because different research is studying different things, they include different practices, and it's even harder across contexts, or across international contexts, it becomes very difficult. So what is measured in New Zealand might be different than what is measured in the UK, due to different kind of social norms of engagement between strangers, which there absolutely is here. Like, everyone here does seem a lot happier. I think it's the sun. I don't know, but it's different. It's a different context. And I saw this, so I had a quick look around what was going on in New Zealand, and you would know more of this, but do you remember when Hollaback, which is a big campaigning organisation in the US, did their viral video of a woman walking through New York, and then they recreated one in Auckland? Did you see it? I think it was the Herald recreated it, and the finding was that street harassment doesn't happen in Auckland because apparently that's not true, but because what happened was she got stopped once by someone who asked her if she was European, and then stopped by someone who asked her for directions. And then that was, the only reason that the only verbal intrusions that she had. However, she was stared at quite a lot. And one of the other things that was quite interesting was she kept taking on and off her sunglasses. So again, it's sunny. You wear sunglasses more than you do in London, where there's like no sun. But sunglasses become a form of women's safety work. It creates a barrier. Who here has used sunglasses in order to feel a little bit protected? And so whether or not that also influenced the responses she was getting. We don't know. But across studies, the most popular term, and the one that I just mentioned, is street harassment, which you've probably all heard of. But there's some problems with that as well, even though it's kind of the term that is the most used. The first one is a problem that is with sexual harassment as well. Is it always or only harassing, and is there no problem when it isn't experienced as harassing? So similar to what you were saying about there has to be an experience of harm. I want to be able to talk about the times when I've been interrupted in public, but I found it funny, or I found it complimentary, or I found it kind of annoying, but I haven't felt harassed. I felt irritated. I want to be able to talk about them, and sometimes using the frame of harassment doesn't give women the space to do that. In England, I wanted to ask, do people get told to cheer up here? Do women get told to cheer up? They do. Smile. And to smile. I wasn't sure if it was the UK, because I used to live here and I used to live in Australia, and I can't remember it happening that much. But in the UK, it seems to happen a lot. But I don't know if it's just because I'm studying this, so I'm more aware of it. But that, for me, I don't personally feel harassed when that happens. I feel ticked off. Sometimes I feel different things, but I don't want to say necessarily that I feel harassed. So is that excluding what we can and can't talk about? Is street too limiting? What about the connections to online public spaces? There's connections there in terms of meanings, in terms of the way that men are using women's public space kind of interactions in order to intrude upon them. There's also a problem with the term street harassment in that it actually disconnects sexual harassment from the continuum of violence against women and girls. So this is quite an important point. It's not about denying the fact that other people are targets. And I'm going to talk a little bit about Debbie Epstein's work, which is particularly on sexuality and gender diverse people and their experiences of street harassment. So it's not to deny that, but it's about naming violence against women and girls as a context, situating what this means for women and girls. The fact that when women and girls are being followed down the road, a lot of the time what they're thinking about, the women that I've spoken to, is the possibility of rape. And that's connecting to their own experiences, previous experiences of rape, or close to rape, or threats of rape, or just the prevalence of rape as a reality for women today. So there's an importance in terms of that connection in policy. So it's really important in the UK particularly to have things located as a sexual offence if you want to have it in legislation, because it gives you particular things. One of the things it gives you is anonymity in reporting, and one of the problems with the IBSA legislation in the UK is that it's not located as a sexual offence, and so women and girls who report it do not have, and men and boys don't have, anonymity. Whereas if you're reporting other forms of sexual offences, you do. It's quite important to connect it into that. Also to understand impact, to understand that the impact is cumulative and that it connects to these other forms that women have experienced. If you know about the work of the Child and Women Abuse Studies Unit, you know about the work of Liz Kelly around the continuum of sexual violence, but just to flag it, she uses continuum in two senses. So it's about that it's a continuous series of elements or events that pass into each other and can't be readily distinguished. A good example of that from my research is a woman, Beck, who was, she had a man on the tube say hello to her. He then followed her over several different tube lines, followed her home and attempted to rape her. So what happened there is a series of different forms of harassment and intrusion, but they shade into each other. The following shades into the attempted rape, the being interrupted shades into the following. And also these three senses of continuum in women's lives. So women have our own continuums of all of the different crap that we've experienced, across experience. There's also a continuum within individual forms, and a continuum in terms of the impacts. Okay, so it's not about a hierarchy, it's not about putting one thing up here and one thing down there, it's about saying these things in practice, experientially, fold into each other. Policy doesn't like that, because that's not how policy works. Policy works on categories and hierarchies and all of that stuff. So, research also doesn't like it, because research likes categories and But so things that we know, so again with that caveat that comparisons are very difficult, differences in definitions, differences, I've just put differences, so that's very important, and ambiguity as well. So there's a massive thing with this of did he or didn't he? Is that guy pressing up against me in the tube in a sexually harassing way, or is he just pressing up against me because I live in one of the busiest cities in the world? Did that guy just say that to me, or did he not just say that to me? Is that person staring at me? So there's ambiguity, and those things are very difficult to capture. But some people have tried. You'll see here, there's actually not that much academic research because of some of the difficulties in terms of measurement. But a lot of charities are doing. ActionAid is actually taking this on worldwide as quite a big issue. New Zealand had, and this is the problem sometimes when you look at some of these statistics and you've got as a researcher, and you just go, oh, that's poor research. You're giving research a bit of a bad name here. So this was from Hollaback, did as well, an international study, which was great, with Cornell University. And they went over 42 sites internationally, so it gave quite a good state of what was going on globally, using the same questions, so that was quite good. But then they came up with it in New Zealand, it was 80% had experienced the first experience before 17, and 74% felt followed by men or a man in a way that they felt unsafe. But the sample was 22 people. It was 22 women, and it's just like you can't give percentages if it's 22 women, and also you're just letting the side down. So that's all I could find. There may be bigger studies that I don't know about here. So talk to me about them if you know of them. One of the biggest one that's been done in Europe now is the Fundamental Rights Agency. They did a massive study in 2014 about violence against women across Europe, and they didn't ask specifically about sexual harassment in public, but they did ask about sexual harassment and then if the perpetrator was a stranger, and you could put those things kind of together. And they found that over half of women and girls across Europe had restricted their freedom of movement based on fear. And this was based on, I think it was 36,000 was the sample size. The other thing that we know is that we need an intersectional approach to understanding this. Okay, so not all women are harassed in the same way. We don't want to talk about a woman's experience of sexual harassment. So, good example of this, again from the UK, and I'm imagining that it's happening here, but that's just my assumption, is we're seeing post-Brexit, which they talk about all of the time, we're seeing a rise in women who are identifiably immigrant women, particularly Muslim women wearing the hijab or wearing the burqa, who are being targeted for hate crimes and harassment in public space. But seeing this as just a religious hate crime is actually missing the full picture, because these women are being targeted also because they are women. So because they are women wearing head coverings, they're more identifiable as targets. And also because of the stereotypes that are attached to Southeast Asian women in the UK about being submissive, about being passive, about being not wanting to talk back to men. They're labelled with this stereotype, and that means that men are picking them as easier targets. Okay, so they're being harassed because they are Muslim, they're being harassed because they are women, they're being harassed because they are both. So we need to think about this in an intersectional way. This is the point Debbie Epstein makes when she talks about the prevalence of sexual harassment of gender and sexuality diverse people in public. So thinking here gay or transgender men, for example. And she argues that we should think about sexual harassment as heterosexist harassment, in order to kind of foreground the way that it's used to police the norms of heterosexuality. Okay, what we don't know is quite a lot. Don't know a lot about perpetrators. They've done some work in London on offenders on the public transport system, but it's more focused on behaviours, not on motivation. But one of the things that I found quite interesting was that they can profile basically offenders on public transport system, again in London, act in a very different way than normal people do when they're on the public transport system. So normal people will be kind of looking to see what the time is and then pretty much playing on their phone. That's all they do. Whereas offenders will miss several trains, They will go on behind particular people, and they'll be looking around to see who is getting on, what train at what time. But again, that's more on behaviours and not on the motivation. Some studies that have been done on motivation, this one from 1984 has some of the best research methodology. They just basically stopped every man that harassed them on the street and asked them to do a survey, which I thought was brilliant. Wouldn't get that through ethics now, you could try. And the biggest reason was boredom. Boredom. But this is what men are saying face to face, so, But a minority was to antagonise, so a minority did it just to annoy women. And another small minority did it because they wanted women to feel better about themselves. So I thought that's what they were doing. And 20% said that they only did it with others, and that's something that's actually been reaffirmed in future research, that this is around social bonding. So this is another way that men are kind of using women's bodies as a way to communicate their masculinity to other men. We don't know how much we forget, obviously, and this key thing is that we don't know how much we prevent, and that's where I want to focus really just for the rest of this. So does everyone know this fear of crime paradox, criminologists? So the idea that women are more likely to report fear of crime in public space, but men are more likely to be victims. And there's been quite a few different explanations. It's probably a combination of all of them. So this idea around gender roles and representation, there's been research done, I think it was Sutton Farrell actually, that shows that men were more likely to give socially desirable responses. So the idea that men probably are very scared of crime in public space, but actually that doesn't fit with what they have to present, and so they're not going to admit to researchers that they are scared. A lot of this shadow of sexual assault thesis, which is the fact that sexual assault is a particular type of crime and a particular type of fear of crime that women experience that men don't experience to the same extent. They do experience it. And that overshadows experiences of other forms of crime. So when women are saying that they're scared of crime, they're scared of sexual assault. Betsy Stanko basically kind of throws it all on his head and says, well, what are we counting as criminal here? What about all of the things that women experience that we don't count as criminal, that increase their fear of crime, so their everyday public sexual harassment? And I want to talk about safety work. So what's never really spoken that much about is maybe women are actually doing a whole heap of stuff because they're scared of crime that means that they're less likely to be victims. So maybe we're actually preventing the crime. But it's never looked at like that. It's looked at instead like, why are women so paranoid when this isn't happening? Not the fact that we could actually be doing something to affect the fact that it's not happening. And this came out so strongly in my research. So this is from Theodora. So I'll just read it. So at the start, she's like, I actually personally feel quite safe. The area where I live, it's not, people say it's a bad area, but I've never felt unsafe walking around it. Maybe that's because that's where I grew up. I've always felt quite safe, to be honest. I mean, I tend to, as a general rule, I feel quite safe. I've never felt like I couldn't walk home alone if I've needed to or wanted to. Okay, and it was shared. That was shared across a lot of the women that I spoke to. And then we kept talking. And then she just randomly gives this list of things that she does in public. And the way that she gives it is so matter of fact. Of course you would do this. Stop, check your phone, tie your shoelace, anything like that. Always in a doorway though, if you're tying your shoelace, don't get on the ground. Never, I would never, if I want someone to get past me, I try to get my back to a wall. If you sort of stop and stand with your back to a wall, look at them. I never want to do that because I think it might cause a confrontation, but if you stand and sort of kneel down to tie your shoelace or something like that, then there's a reason to stop, if you see what I mean. She's just, that's just what she has. And she wasn't putting those two things together. She wasn't putting together the fact that this is some of what is creating this sense of safety. And this safety work gets lost when studies are focused on how safe do you feel in public space, which a lot of the crime surveys are. So we lose the fact that we're actually restricting our freedom. We lose the fact that as Theodora is walking down the street, she's looking around to see what's going on, who's behind her, does it feel dodgy? If it feels dodgy, she starts doing this little routine. So this is all the development of safety work, which is, it's something that Liz has this habit of just saying things and then never actually writing it down. Lots of professors seem to do this. But so it's a development she always talks about in her lectures about violence work as the work that survivors do in the aftermath of violence, so just crack on in the world. And safety work is the work that we do to feel safer. And it's a development of emotional labour, which was Alice Hochschild's concept from the research that she did with flight attendants. The key point is that it becomes repeated over time, so much that it just becomes habitual and hidden. It just becomes part of what you do when you walk out the door. And it becomes absorbed into our bodies is one of the things that I really found. So everyone has that joke around man spreading, a man taking up space on public transport and women not taking up space. And one of the things that I started to notice was that women would create a little barrier. So we would put our bag on our lap, or we would cross our legs, or we would pull ourselves in. And that's not just women's embodiment, that's a social impact, has changed the way that we are a lot of the time in our bodies in public. And there's that tension between safety and freedom, so not being able to necessarily do or be exactly what we want, because to do that sometimes doesn't feel that safe. And of course, sometimes we just think, stuff it, I'm just going to do what I want to do, but then I feel less safe. And sometimes some women are willing to take that hit. It's all about this idea of evaluation. So the right amount of panic was from Katie Lou, one of my participants, and it was one of those things, for any of you who have done research, when someone says something and you just go, that's it, you've just got it. And so she's talking about this continual contradiction, basically. we're used to being, it's conflicting messages, it's take care of yourself, and you're being a silly woman, you have to have the right amount of panic. And there is no right amount, that's the point, there's never a right amount. But you've got to try and find it. And if you panic too much, you're paranoid. And if you don't panic enough, it's your fault. And so you're stuck in the middle. And it's all facilitated by men using ambiguous spaces as a resource. So really using those spaces where it is hard to know exactly what they are doing. Are you being crazy? Are you being paranoid? Are you narcissistic? What's going on? For another time, this idea it's all part of growing up, that so much of this starts so young, and that the messages that young girls get, even children, 7, 8 years old, is that this is kind of an inevitable part of the world and there's not really much you can do about it. We're blamed when unsuccessful for not preventing it, but the key point is that you can't measure success. So you're stuffed, basically. You just keep trading this freedom for safety just in case. And so Liz Stanley and Sue Wise in 1987 wrote a book which is fantastic called Georgie Porgy and Sexual Harassment. It still stands up. But they really talk about this idea that you can't measure success of your safety work. You can never find out, because success is something that didn't happen. So if you did it right, it didn't happen. So yeah. So we're taught to not experience that as being successful, basically. So, okay, one time. In terms of taking action, everyone wants to focus on legislative responses. Some work that I did with Bianca Fileborn, who works in Australia and has done fantastic work on this stuff. She did some research, a survey, asking both women and men about, do you want, what's justice for you? What would justice look like in terms of this? And what she found was that for a lot of them, they didn't actually want to have a legislative response. They wanted education, they wanted prevention, and they did want legal in terms of this role in setting social norms, which you talked about, symbolic. But it was less about actually putting people in prison or fining them for this, and more about actually education. On-the-spot fines, so New Zealand does have on-the-spot fines, but it's limited to verbal, which is problematic given the range. But also it might speak something to what I said earlier about how when they did that video she wasn't spoken to that much. Maybe it has done something to change the norms of interaction. There's a hate crime framing that's been trialled in Nottingham in England, and it's actually going quite well, and so I think Bristol's taken it on now, where misogyny is included as a hate crime, so you can report it as a hate crime. And it's good because hate crime legislation, you don't have to single out single aspects of your identity. You can report it as a hate crime based on misogyny, religion and race all at the same time. But it's slightly problematic because it's not in that violence against women and girls framing. It's in a different framing. And in England we have a integrated violence against women and girls policy. And like I said, in legislation it's quite important to keep all of these things together. So not sure how that's going to go. But if prevention is about changing gender norms, like I was saying before, it's about changing that idea of women's bodies as acted through, not on. So this idea that we're constantly kind of acted on, not only with sexual harassment, but like beauty practices, all of this stuff, but actually women experiencing our bodies as a capacity. And I think when we think about that, we come back to this idea of feminist self-defense as a prevention strategy. I don't know how it's gone here, but it's something that's been wildly kind of given up on, really, in the UK, to be honest. Everyone stopped talking about it. Everyone's like, oh no, that's victim blaming, we're not going to go there. And yet everyone wants to focus on education. And I think that if we're thinking about self-defense, not about being necessarily preventing an attack, but about having an experience of your body as a capacity, maybe there is a space for it in prevention. And there is something very important, I think, about making visible our safety work and our ordinary resistance to others and to ourselves. So talking about it and starting to think about it, starting to acknowledge it, talking to your friends, and just starting to get a sense of, is this what we're all actually doing, kind of without really being aware. And there's some groups that have started doing this. So there's actually a lot of groups, but I've chosen 3 that are my favourite. So, well, this is two combined in one slide. So Girls at AtDhabas, does anyone know about these in Pakistan? So AtDhabas are like local roadside cafes, and basically it was just men's space. And so this young woman, just the woman in the blue shirt, sort of Kari, she decided to go to AtDhabas and take a picture of herself. She put it on Instagram with the hashtag Girls at AtDhabas. And she did this like for a couple of weeks, and then she started to notice that other women and girls were starting to do the same thing, and so it became a bit of a movement. And then some researchers from India got in touch, who had done a study in Mumbai in, I think it was 2009, published in 2011, about women in public spaces in Mumbai, and they'd found the same thing, that women were just not in public space. So women in public spaces were doing something, they were going somewhere, or but they weren't just loitering, they weren't just hanging out. And so they had this Why Loiter movement, where they're encouraging women once a week to come together, to go into public space and to just loiter. No reason to be there, which is very interesting. And so they've teamed up. So this is happening in Pakistan and in India. It's great. This I had to include because this is one of my projects, which I love. So after my doctoral research, I got some money to develop it into a prevention workshop. As Nicola was saying, my background was actually in doing prevention work with young people, and so I knew that this was kind of something that I always wanted to do with it. And so I worked together with Rape Crisis South London, which is one of the biggest rape crisis centres in England, and an organisation called Purple Drum, which is the young women's team at Imkaan, which is a second-tier organisation working with violence against black and minority ethnic women. And we worked together with an amazing all-women theatre company called Doll's Eye Theatre. They came up with a script based on my research. It was like a series of different vignettes of different... So one was like a bus scene. This one's the bus scene. That one's the woman talking about being flashed in Morrison's. And created this, like a series of short vignettes. Then we wrote a workshop, and now it's gone into schools, and it's finishing now. It just finished as I left in front of me. And it's been delivered to 1,500 students so far in London and the North East. And when I get back, I'm going to do some evaluation on it and see how that goes. We also wrote a set of lesson plans to give the teachers afterwards to continue the conversations in schools, which is all freely available. So I've also got these things which I can give you, which has got a lot of links and stuff like that on them. So this I love, and this is kind of happening at the moment, and it's the response from the kids has been amazing. It's just been great. We've had boys being like, oh, I never actually knew that girls were doing that. And you're like, oh, yay, yes. And this is the last one. So this is Purple Drum, which is one of my favourite organisations, I think, in the UK. And they... For the mayoral elections, one of the things that we wanted to do was focus on racialised. One of the things they wanted to do was focus on racialised sexual harassment in the capital. And so they worked with the Violence Against Women Coalition to do a small YouGov survey. And then they created this amazing video. And the thing is about this is that they kind of encapsulate everything that I found in my research in about 5 minutes. So I'm going to leave you, we're going to go to them.
Sexual harassment is a really everyday experience for so many women and girls. whistling, staring. I could be in jeans and boots like today, and it's, oi, sexy.
I get catcalled in a racialized sexual way. So people will say things like, hola, señorita.
Being called like a black whore because you wouldn't give your number away to some guy in a club like who's harassing you the entire time, whose only approach to you, by the way, was to grab your body, bits of my body, without consent.
Because it might not be like physically violent, but it has like far-reaching effects on, you know, the people that it happens to.
So because of gender inequality in society, I think that sexual harassment is one manifestation of that, and that men and boys feel that they have a certain level of entitlement and ownership over women and girls' bodies.
I felt like the person who is, like the perpetrator, should I say, is, it seems like they feel like it's normal.
You must respond to them because they've spoken to you, and you must speak when you're spoken to. It's kind of this expectation that's not written anywhere, but kind of governs our social norms.
Very rarely do people step in, actually. I suppose they feel it's not their place, and it makes you feel humiliated. And onlookers just think that you're in the wrong.
Saying to my friend, like, I'm actually so angry right now because this is now my automated response, is to actually smile and pretend like, oh, it's fine, when really, actually, that's really affected me.
It's a common misconception that those minor incidents are minor. They're not. In the minds of those who experience them, they're not.
It's really important to talk about race when we talk about sexual harassment.
My experiences are different as a black woman than they are for my white friends. I should be up for it, or that I am fair game, or that I shouldn't care if my body's touched in a specific way.
After me ignoring them, that's when it turns racial. So that's when it might be, you black this or you black that, how dare you ignore me?
The next thing you know, he starts making monkey noises at me. And I'm just like, okay, so you go from objectifying me, from me being like the sexual thing to you, and then when you get rejected, you think it's okay for you to then, you know, shout, you know, racist taunts.
It makes me feel really vulnerable.
Almost suffocated. I mean, I'm sure it has an effect on my mental health, the fact that I have to think about it every day. As soon as I leave the house, this is going to happen to me, I need to be prepared.
We don't have freedom of movement because it's always there.
It means that from quite an early age, you start to control your own behaviour.
I walk out onto the street and I don't smile.
I never make eye contact with men when I'm walking anywhere.
Or I will wear something and be like, oh, I can't really wear this because this is going to lead to... And these are things that I want to wear. I want to smile, I want to like walk down the street and look like a friendly person.
And it has changed the way that I am. I am quite guarded, I am quite suspicious.
There was, for example, my phone died one time and I wasn't listening to any music, but I was just pretending to listen to music, just so people could leave me alone almost.
I'd love to give some decent advice because I know it happens all the time, but I don't really have any. And I don't have any because it's not discussed.
I think it's not taken seriously enough.
Why do we have to carry the burden or like do all the emotional labour for them to actually realise that what they're doing is okay? I think men need to talk to each other and say, actually, don't do that, that's really messed up.
And I think what can be done about it is making sure that our transport systems are safe for young women.
I'd just like to move around like a bird, be free, wear whatever I want to wear, say whatever I want to say and do whatever I want to do.